I lived in a very small town for many years. It was quiet and safe. I liked living there, except for the laundromat. It was an older, kind of run-down building with large windows that were hazy from years of dust and residue from the machines. It was located right at the edge of town, and there was nothing beyond it but country roads. I often found myself there late at night due to my odd work hours. I was single, so I'd always go alone. It wasn't the most pleasant place with its fluorescent lights and dank, musty smell, but it was the only one in town, so I didn't have much choice. Over the course of a few months, I began to notice a man walking past the laundromat windows every time I was there. He was a normal-looking guy, average height, shoulder-length hair, dressed in regular clothes, always alone. He'd walk by, peer in, and continue on his way. It seemed like he slowed down a little when he walked by and looked in, but I couldn't tell for sure. It was a little unsettling, but I mostly ignored it. I thought maybe he had a job that ended late and just happened to be walking home from work at the same time I did my laundry. Also, one thing I had learned about tiny towns was that people could be a little nosy, so I just shrugged it off. One night, after loading my clothes into the dryer, I decided to run to the 7-Eleven down the block for a snack. I was gone maybe 15 minutes. When I returned, I froze in my tracks. Through the hazy window, I could see the man inside the laundromat, rummaging through my laundry in the dryer. My heart pounded in my chest as he looked up, noticing me in the window. The look on his face was so odd, just a blank stare with no emotion of any kind. We looked at each other for a moment, then he began walking towards the door, holding one of my bras in his hand. At this point, I was legitimately terrified. I looked up and down the street, but it was nearly 11 p.m. and there was absolutely nobody around, so I turned and ran back to the 7-Eleven. When I got there, I must have looked terrified because the clerk immediately asked me what was wrong. I quickly explained the situation and he called the police, then stood outside of the store keeping watch while I waited inside. The store was around the corner from the laundromat, so I couldn't see where the man went after I ran away, but he never came back our way. The police officer on duty arrived a few minutes later, but the man was gone. My clothes were scattered on the floor of the laundromat, but nothing else was disturbed. He took my statement, but without any witnesses, there wasn't much he could do. The laundromat didn't have security cameras, so there was no way to figure out who the man was. After that night, I started using the laundromat in the next town over, even if it meant a longer drive. It was worth driving an extra 20 minutes each way for peace of mind. I never saw the man again.
It was a beautiful summer day, perfect for a weekend camping trip. My girlfriend and I had been driving deep into the Rocky Mountains and we just found a great spot. We spent the afternoon setting up our tent and organizing our campsite. It was a typical routine, sorting out the sleeping bags, setting up the small camping stove, and finding a good place for our cooler full of food. We loved camping, so the process was familiar and comforting. After we set up camp, we decided to explore the surrounding woods. We hiked on some nearby trails for the rest of the day, probably 4 to 5 hours. By the time we returned to our campsite, we were tired but happy. As dusk fell, we started a campfire. The warmth and light from the fire were comforting in the cool mountain air. We sat back in our camping chairs, roasting marshmallows over the flames. It was just what we needed after a long day of hiking and setting up camp. But as we were relaxing, a strange sound started coming from a nearby campsite. It sounded like it was a few hundred feet away, but it was hard to tell for sure. At first, it was barely noticeable, a soft chuckle that was carried to us on the wind. It didn't worry us much at first. We figured it was just another camper enjoying their evening. But as time went on, the laughter grew louder and more frequent. This wasn't a group of friends sharing a joke around their own fire, but the laughter of a lone man. The sound came in waves, growing louder and then quieter, then a little louder, then quieter again. Something about it was eerie and off-putting. It wasn't a joyful laugh. It's difficult to describe, but it's almost like he was laughing at something that he knew wasn't funny. The laughter came in waves of varying intensity for the next hour or so. My girlfriend and I did our best to ignore it. At one point, I asked if she wanted to leave, but she said it was probably just a hippie on mushrooms and nothing to worry about. The laughter eventually died down, and we assumed the man had gone to bed. The strange laughter had been making us uneasy, so we were relieved to hear it stop. Then about half an hour later, we heard the crunching of sticks and leaves. My girlfriend and I stopped talking, listening as the crunching sounds grew closer. Moments later, a figure emerged from the forest. It was the man from the other campsite walking towards us. His laughter was gone, replaced with an unsettling quietness as he moved closer to our campfire. He stepped into the light of the fire. He was heavily tattooed, his arms and neck adorned with ink that disappeared under his baggy, rough clothes. His hair was slicked back into an oily ponytail under a backward cap, and he sported a patchy, unkempt beard. As he approached us, his movements were twitchy and unnatural. As he got closer, I could see his eyes were glassy and wild. It was clear he was under the influence of some kind of substance. "Hey, mind if I join you?" he asked, his voice thin and shaky. Obviously, I didn't want him to join us, but I was worried how he might react if I told him to leave. Wanting to avoid trouble, I said yes, although I made it clear we were tired from hiking all day and would be going to bed soon. After a bit of small talk about the forest and camping, his laughter returned. This time, it was even more unsettling, a bout of insane giggles that seemed triggered by something only he found amusing. He began muttering to himself, and while I couldn't make out everything he was saying, I was able to pick up the phrases, "I had no choice," and "all they had to do was listen." The situation had just taken a dark turn, and I needed to be prepared in case things got worse. I had a handgun in my truck about 20 feet away from our campsite, but I didn't want to leave my girlfriend alone with the strange man. I asked my girlfriend to help me look for something in the truck. We excused ourselves and retrieved the gun, discussing our plan of escape. We agreed to tell the man we're calling it a night, and once he's gone, we'd pack up as quickly as we could, then get out of there. As we returned to the campsite, the man looked at us, his eyes darting back and forth. "Were you talking about me?" he asked. I calmly responded that we were just discussing how tired we were from a long day of hiking. I told him that while it had been great chatting, we needed to call it a night. He nodded, but it was clear he wasn't hearing me. He turned his gaze back to the campfire and said he was going to stay and watch the flames for a while. I told him I needed to put out the fire and we really had to be getting to bed. I was polite but stern. He stared at me for a long time, his face blank and emotionless. I prepared to grab the gun from my belt. After a long, uncomfortable moment, the man got up and walked into the forest without saying a word. My girlfriend and I stood silently in place, listening as the man's footsteps faded into the distance. Once he was out of sight, we sprung into action. Moving as quickly as we could, we threw our belongings into the truck bed and put the fire out. As we walked to the truck, the cackling started up again. It seemed to be getting closer. My girlfriend and I jumped in the truck and drove off into the night, grateful to be getting away from the laughter in the forest.